Welcome to BARC's July Ecology Club on the politics and power dynamics of natural resource mapping. BARC's Ecology Club is a monthly gathering on the second Wednesday of each month to discuss a theme or topic that pertains to BARC's work. BARC's mission is to transform Mount Hood National Forest into a place where natural processes prevail, where wildlife thrives, and where local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. Since 1999, BARC has organized people from communities around Mount Hood National Forest to keep watch over the ecological conditions of the forest and the actions of the federal agency tasked with managing these public lands, the Forest Service. You can find more information at www.bark-out.org or find BARC on Facebook or Instagram at BARC for Mount Hood. My name is Misha Van Eaton. I work as BARC's Forest Watch Assistant, and I am your host for the night. Before our presenters get started, I would like to invite you all to participate in BARC's land acknowledgement practice. This is a practice that BARC has developed for all of our events. I'll be reading BARC's accountability statement that is on this slide and asking you all to participate in journaling and reflection afterwards. As an organization founded by white people in the lineage of settler colonial environmentalism, BARC understands that conservation work is embedded in the white supremacist legacy of colonization, land theft, cultural erasure, and genocide, and the systemic use of law to suppress Native sovereignty over their homelands. We understand that BARC's dedication to protecting the stolen lands, referred to now as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest, carries with it a paradox which continues to be ignored by most conservation groups, and which continues to harm Indigenous people. In our advocacy and policy work, BARC's interactions with federal agencies often comply with the authority assumed by the U.S. federal government. This authority was assumed through the legalized displacement and genocide of Indigenous people and cultures, including through the legislative creation of public lands. These crimes and injustices have not been reconciled nor rectified. Today, all non-Native people have the privilege of primary access to these public lands as a direct result of this strategy of legalized supremacy. BARC recognizes that conservation organizations like ours are complicitly participating in the ongoing displacement of Native people and culture each time settlers claim the benefit of access to this land and by engaging the paradox of protecting stolen land. We are working to change the vision, mission, and strategies of our organization. BARC affirms that these are the rightful homelands of the Multnomah, Molalla, Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Tenino, Wasco, Wishram, Paiute, and the many other Native people who live here and who have always lived here, who have always belonged to and cared for this land, and whose bold resistance to colonial oppression should guide us all. Now I would like to respectfully invite any Native people here today to have a few minutes to speak freely. If you would like to speak, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or type into the chat. BARC is committing to the work necessary to repair relationships between settler descendants and Indigenous people, and between all non-Indigenous people and the land. Acknowledgement is just the necessary first step in this revolutionary cultural work. We ask all non-Indigenous participants to practice humility, respect, and acknowledgement by personally dedicating your time, energy, action, and resources to support the people who rightfully belong to this land. If you have practiced acknowledgement with BARC before, please get the notebook that you use for this practice. If this is your first practice, please get something to write with. I'll give everyone 20 seconds to go do that. Okay, we'll get started. So please take the next 2 to 3 minutes to write some instructions, intentions, actions, and next step for yourself, outlining how you will develop your practice of acknowledgement through action. If you've been to a recent BARC event, please revisit what you have set out for yourself to do, and take this time to reflect on your efforts and update your intention and action plan. All right, please take the next 20 seconds or so to wrap up your writing. Okay, and please set aside your journal and turn your attention away from yourself and join me in a moment of respectful silence and contemplation and humility in honor of the original people here tonight, across this continent, in the past, present, and the future. Thank you all for supporting this important practice. It's important that you continue to practice acknowledgement through action in all areas of your life. So with that, we're going to get started with the presentation. Tonight, we're lucky to have Sachi Arakawa, Rebecca McLain, and David Banis here to discuss the complexities of mapping contested landscapes with a case study that is an example of values mapping in the forests of the Olympic Peninsula. Sachi is a founding organizer of Mapping Action Collective, a group based in Oregon that supports the work of grassroots organizations and social movements with maps and data. As a modern-day mapper, Sachi often encounters problems with how maps are created or communicated, and in her work with the Mapping Action Collective, she seeks to put the power of mapping back into the hands of the people, creating maps and data sets that support communities rather than commodify, exclude, or misrepresent them. Rebecca is the Research Program Director for the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State University. She has a PhD in Forest Management from the University of Washington with a focus on the social aspects of natural resource management. She has a long-standing interest in the politics that surround the development and the use of maps for asserting claims over territory and conveying values associated with forested landscapes. Over the past decade, she has helped design and implement a series of cultural values mapping projects on national forests in the Pacific Northwest. David manages the Center for Spatial Analysis and Research in the Geography Department at Portland State University, working with a wide variety of partners at the federal, state, and local levels. His work explores the diverse ways that cartographers can tell stories with maps, focusing on the mapping of non-traditional subjects. He has a number of research programs that employ public participatory mapping to explore how cultural values and human perceptions of places and landscapes might be used in land management. He teaches courses on cartography, map use and analysis, and geographic information systems.
Thank you, Misha. Hi, everyone. As Misha said, my name is Sachi. I use she or they pronouns. Before I get started, I actually thought as a way for everyone else to introduce themselves, we could do a little icebreaker question for you to answer. So I kind of hate the word icebreaker. It sounds so like corny and corporate, but whatever, we're breaking ice. So the two questions that I had, and you can answer either one of these, feel free to not answer as well, but you can answer in the chat. So hopefully most of you are familiar with how to use the Zoom chat. You should be able to type a message in there. So the first question is, what is the last map you used or looked at? And the other question is, what is your favorite map? So I think at least some of you all have probably used Google Maps within the last week. So I can safely say someone's looked at it. Almost all of you have looked at a map recently, or some way to navigate and find your way around. But maybe we have some more interesting responses there. Maybe some folks have seen maps in the news, some other cool maps that you'd like to talk about. So you can put those in the chat. And if you care to share pronouns or name, feel free to do that as well now in the chat. So yeah, so as Misha said, I organize with a group called Mapping Action Collective that's based here in Portland, and we do a lot of mapping to support social justice and environmental justice. We work with BARC. We've done work on the Beaver Mapping Project. I also am a frequent attendee of BARC Abouts and have been to several ecology clubs. So it's exciting to be here tonight and share some of what I do with you all. So we're going to be talking about values mapping today and counter mapping as well, specifically in contested landscapes like national parks and national forests. And I'll get more into exactly what we mean by that in a minute. But first, because we're going to talk so much about maps, I kind of wanted to level set and just ask a really basic question, which is, what is a map? And more importantly, who gets to make maps? Is there a right way to make a map? And who decides what the right way to make a map is? So I don't know if we'll have enough time to actually have people unmute and fully talk out this question. But if folks want to answer the question of what is a map in the chat, I'm curious to hear what people think. So I put down this note here, and Misha might kind of fill out sticky notes as we're talking here and add to this slide if people have comments about what their version of what a map is. But my little kind of basic Oxford Dictionary response here on this sticky note is, a map is a diagram of an area of land or sea showing physical features, cities, roads, etc. So this is a very kind of typical idea of what a map is, right? But maps can be a lot more than that. Maps represent, as I'm already seeing some really cool favorite maps here in the chat. And so I think we can all agree that maps go beyond just navigation. They go beyond just telling us, what exists in a place, just like, the physical elements. Maps can also say a lot about meaning and identity and the way that we interact with our surroundings, something that's oftentimes called sense of place. So if anyone has thoughts about what a map is beyond just a diagram of land, feel free to drop that in the chat as well, and Misha will add those comments to the slide, and we can kind of work on this as we're talking through the rest of these slides. So what is a map? So I'm just going to talk through some of my ideas of what a map is based on my experience as someone who makes maps and also who's consumed and loved maps for a long time. So obviously maps are, can be documents that help us navigate. There's the ubiquitous Google Maps and Apple Maps and all these other navigation programs that are digital maps that now help us navigate. We used to use atlases, right? Road atlases. Some of those of us who can remember that sometimes wonder how we ever got around using those things. And then, of course, there's also political maps, right? This map on the right-hand side here is a world map. Also, I will mention this is in the Mercator projection. I don't know if there's any map nerds out there. I'm not going to dive deep into the concept of map projections, but essentially the idea is that when you create a map of the Earth, which is a round surface, you need to flatten that map onto a flat surface, unless it's a 3D map, of course. But if we're making a 2D map, we're flattening something round onto a flat surface. And by doing that, you have to have some distortion somewhere. And map projections are a way of correcting for that distortion. And there's a whole different variety of them, and they all distort land in different ways. So any flat map that you look at is not a true depiction of what the world looks like, right? But we think of maps, you know, you see this map of the world, this very like commonly shared map of the world, and you think this is what the earth looks like. You know, this is the size of the countries, this is, you know, the way that their spatial relationship is with each other. But the reality is it's not. This is a product of human creation. You know, also these political boundaries, right, are a figment of human creation as well. They're social construct. So I guess my point in showing you this map is, you know, this is the type of map I was taught on in school, and I really, you know, this was kind of burned into my mind as like what the world actually looks like and what it is. But in reality, it's not. And it's very, maps are very political. They have, you know, there's a lot of bias behind how they're made. And so it's important that we like understand that as people who are consuming and reading and using maps. So what else is a map? So here is actually, I'll get out of presenter view and actually quickly show you guys this map, because this is my favorite map, or one of them. I also am very partial to hand-drawn maps, but this one is certainly very technical. This is, you can play around with this too if you want. It's earth.nullschool.net. I can drop this link in the chat if people are interested in checking it out. This is one of the coolest digital maps I've ever seen. This is satellite, essentially almost real-time imagery of the Earth and various systems. So here we're looking at wind, surface winds. We can change it to look at ocean currents here. We can look at particulate matter. And, you know, we can kind of position ourselves. Where are we? Here we are in Oregon. You can zoom all the way in and, you know, watch weather patterns and things. So this is another way of depicting the world, of understanding our place in the world and all of the different, you know, systems, environmental systems that go into the place that we live. So another version of what a map is. But maps don't have to be so complex. I'm going to go down here next, because I think this is an interesting kind of juxtaposition to that very technical map. So this is a very simple map. It's an Inuit map from Greenland from the 1500s, I believe. It's a navigational map showing the coastline of some part of Greenland. And you can see here, this is where the coastline would be. Actually, this little carving section here, and I don't know what, I'm forgetting what word I would use to describe this, but this ditch here actually showed them where to pull their canoe up and go into the uplands here to get around an area that was impassable by the ocean. So something very simple, does not look like a map you would typically see. You know, if you had showed me this without context, I would never have guessed that was a map, or it would have taken me a while to get there. But another version of what a map can be, and a very, like, you know, very connected to place, I feel like this map is. You know, it's very tactile, and you're actually like touching the coastline as you're using it, you know, the carved coastline. So going back to Oregon and to Mount Hood, where BARC does a lot of their work, there's also many different ways to interpret and to communicate our natural places as well. Here's 3 different ways of showing Mount Hood, right? This is, I think, like a green trails map. We've got topo lines and trails here. Down here in the bottom left is this kind of funny old illustration of Mount Hood. We've got timberline with some snow on the roof, Timberline Lodge. We've got some skiers flying off the mountain. I mean, arguably, you know, is this even a map? Is this just an illustration? If it's not to scale, is it a map? You know, how do we define a map is one question I would challenge you with. And up here we have a precipitation map showing the rain shadow that Mount Hood creates. So 3 different ways to interpret and communicate one place, right? So then we come to the question of who can make a map. and who gets to decide who can make a map? And in my opinion, the answer is anyone can make a map. The sort of caveats I would have to that is there's some technical expertise, in some cases a lot of technical expertise. You need to create maps just in terms of actually creating the map itself, but also understanding things like map projections and various geographic concepts that you have to become familiar with. Also, as lay people, as just like folks out in the world using maps, I think it's really important to be engaged with spatial and geographic concepts and kind of understand the biases that go into map making, understand the different forces that go into it, and in order to actually be able to understand if a map is accurate. And David and Rebecca are going to talk a little more about ways that maps can kind of be really political and and can really like be skewed depending on the positionality of the person creating the map. So that being said, though, everyone can make a map. So I'm going to actually have everyone, hopefully you still have your pen and paper from our land acknowledgement practice handy. So if you can grab a piece of paper and a pen or pencil, and if you don't have one, I also found this kind of cool thing online called sketchpad.io or sketch.io. I'll put the link in the chat if anyone's interested in checking that out. It looks like this. It's basically just a digital sketch pad. You have a little pin up here. Oh, I've already started drawing on it, so I guess it saves my old drawings. But you can draw on your laptop if you really can't find a pen and pencil and piece of paper. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a couple, maybe 5-10 seconds to start getting your materials together. And these are the instructions for those of you who have everything together already. Okay, so let's get started. So using your pen and paper and relying solely on your own experience, don't look at your phone, don't look at the internet, don't pull up some other map, draw the place where you live. The scale that you draw the map at and whatever features you choose to put on your map are totally up to you. Your map could be at the city scale. So if you're in Portland, you could draw the whole city of Portland with the river going from St. John's down to, Selwood. Or you can draw it at like more of the district scale, like Southeast Portland, Southwest Portland, or you can draw just your neighborhood, maybe your couple blocks. There's no incorrect way to do this. I encourage creativity. I've done this exercise many times myself, and I always have a lot of fun with just playing around with what I put on there. My map elements, like a scale bar and a north arrow, if you choose to have those. So no artistic skill needed, and go ahead and start. I'll give you 5 minutes. Okay, yes, I'm unmuted. All right, so let's wrap up. We've got about we've got 5-7 minutes, something like that, to share some of these. So I would love if we had a couple volunteers who might want to unmute, and maybe, you can just hold your map up to the camera. I'm sure they're all terrible, so it doesn't matter if we see them or not anyway. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure they're beautiful. But yeah, you can, it doesn't, we'd love to see it, but it's okay if it's not perfect, or if we can't see it very well. So if you want to unmute and maybe tell us a little bit about your map. Clarice, I see you offering up a first share. What are we looking at here?
This is my very, very local neighborhood map with the street numbers. I'm on West 5th, and you probably can't even see really, but you see my house and my garage there. The garage looks bigger than the house, but at any rate. And I did put north, south, east, and west somewhere on here. Let's see, right up here by my finger. The ocean is right over here. So that's it. Pretty simple.
Beautiful. It looks like there's maybe only one house on your block there. Is that?
That's true. It's the only important one, of course.
I see. Yeah, that's. See, this is now we're getting into values mapping, people. What do we put on a map? What's important to us,
It's
right?
the center of my universe.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I remember once in a class I had years ago, we did this activity, and someone who just moved to Portland, they drew a map of Portland, and it was just Target and their house, because those were like the only two places they had really been in Portland.
More you need in life.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share?
I'll share, but I'm not sure how to get I can't see myself, so.
Yeah, we can't, it looks like your camera is off. If this is that Rebecca talking?
It's Sarah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sarah, I think I did see you earlier. I see Rebecca has her hand up. Yes, we can see your map. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know how well you can see it, but I had fun, basically. Drawing Forest Park and the bridges and the freeways. And there's a lot of distortion. And I recognized that I drew Burnside north of 84, so I had to erase and redo that. So it's kind of fun to try and test yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times the way that we draw maps too is because we have this, what they call geographic imagination, this spatial concept of things up in our heads that comes from the way we're perceiving the world as we're moving around it, the way we think about navigating when we're on our own, actually trying to find our way around. The images we hear every day, the things we see, those all go into how we kind of create maps and meaning about place in our own head. And so I think that, those, I'm seeing the trees that you drew there, I can kind of see the city through your eyes and what's important and what really comes through as valuable to you. And I can see that you maybe aren't the best with directions. Like myself, that's why I make maps, so it's okay. Anyone else want to share? Or even just talk about, Rebecca, did you have, Rebecca Boley, did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something?
Oh, I did have it up, but just to be a second person, so I don't need to share my map. No worries.
Oh, please feel free to share if you'd like to.
Oh, let's see if I can.
Can't see your camera. Oh, great, there you are, yeah.
I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Okay. So yeah, it's got the north. The only thing of real interest is and like you've been saying, you put down places that, I can't list everything. And so trying to choose what to put in there was the hardest part for me. But I did put in my sea monster for you right there.
Great. I love the legend too. That's very helpful. Yeah, that's a great point that, when you are making a map, and especially those of us who make print maps, it's always a challenge to decide what to actually put on the map. You can't put everything. I think that's something that a lot of map makers early on want to do. They just want everything because it's so cool to be able to map things. But you really have to make that kind of artistic choice, or in some cases, just practical choice. Of what goes on and what doesn't. But that's creating, again, this bias that map makers have of what's important and what's not based on, our own preconceived ideas and positionalities. So I think that just kind of underscores the fact, again, that all map making is biased, that no maps are neutral, that maps are not necessarily fact. They're, they are a human construct like everything else. And, they can also be used as tools, political tools, to kind of illustrate points and show what's important or what isn't to people. Anyone else have a map they'd like to share, or any comments on just this practice of creating a map and thinking about the place that you live? Okay. Oh, I'm seeing Michael's showing us something here. What are we looking at there? I can't hear you, Michael. Are we able to?
Sorry about that. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to draw like Johnson Creek, and maybe the area before there were houses or neighborhoods or streets. So like the watershed there, there's kind of like a steep slope going into the river or the stream there, and there used to be salmon and lamprey, which are kind of showing up again, and then there were like a bunch of historical springs going into the Willamette as well, and then even like I-84 apparently I think used to be a stream as well, like going down into the Willamette. And then like around the Mount Scott area was all like Douglas fir trees, and so I was filling in that in a bit.
I love that pre-colonization map of Portland. Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking at Tanner Springs Park right now. So your map of old, previously buried streams made me think of that too. Yeah, that was one of my favorite maps to see when I first got into maps around Portland, especially historic maps, is all the buried streams. I had no idea.
There's one person in the comments who said that they're wondering about non-visual based maps like a sound map and things that decenter Eurocentric and settler worldview to a more animist and relational map.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question and observation. And I think it's something that we as like a map making community are just starting to, I think the more mainstream map making community anyway. I don't want to not acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of non-traditional map makers out there, or non like status quo kind of map makers out there that are probably doing a lot of really cool creative stuff and are doing. I know because I've seen a lot. But I think the traditional map making and spatial analysis community has a lot to learn about methods and practice. Just the way that we create maps in and of themselves is very centered in Western culture and very, very centered in colonialism, obviously. I mean, a big part of the way that we map today and a lot of the maps that we see, those maps were created for conquest, right? Or to stake a claim. So just thinking about, why are we still using those same tools and creating maps that look like that when I think that doesn't match our values any longer. I think reimagining like even just the media that we use for maps, like Reedy is suggesting sound mapping. I think David's actually done some sound mapping in some of his work that he's done with cultural atlases. One other thing that comes to mind is there was, and I'm going to wrap up here in a second because I want David and Rebecca to have plenty of time to talk about their work. But there was a really cool map maker that came to a cartography symposium that PSU held a while back. And her method of making maps was to actually take old paper maps like topo maps and stuff like that and tear them up and like reform them into a new map. So just tear up like 10, 20 different maps, mix them all together, and then just like take the pieces and create this like new tapestry. And they actually looked quite a bit still like maps, but they were completely fictional places. So I think, just kind of playing with things like that too is really cool.
And people would claim that her maps were actually real places. It's like, I know that place. I've seen that map before, when it's completely made up.
I have, Reedy, it's a great question. And I really want to just spend like the rest of the time answering this question, talking about this, but I should probably leave it at that for now so that David and Rebecca have enough time to discuss. But I'd love to like revisit that topic if we have time later. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David and Rebecca to talk about their values mapping work, and we're gonna talk about some forest politics, y'all. So buckle up. I'm going to stop sharing here, and Rebecca, let you share.
Okay, right. So, okay, so we've been doing something we call human ecology mapping for about 10 years now. And human ecology mapping, it basically consists of a variety of different approaches to mapping. It started, well, from my perspective as an anthropological forester. It started out with tenure and resource use mapping, and that's also local ecological knowledge mapping. And then more recently, sense of place mapping. There's been a fair amount of that going on. And it's sometimes called landscape values mapping or public participation GIS. You might hear those. And there's a variety of data collection strategies that people use: surveys, internet-based maps, individual interviews, and community workshops, and sometimes mapping in the field. So it was about a decade ago or so, the Forest Service became quite interested in understanding what ecosystem services the National Forests provide. And there's a variety of those. Provisioning services, so that would be things like firewood and medicinal plants and timber. Regulating services, those would be things like water flows and climate regulation, pollination. Supporting things like nutrient cycling, habitat for plants and fish, and then the cultural aspect. And that's what, as social scientists, David and I are particularly interested in, is the cultural aspects of things. And, you know, there are a variety of things one could map from, you know, from a cultural standpoint. What we ended up kind of looking at is the values that people assign, the places that are important to people, and then the values people assign to those places, as well as activities that they do in those areas. So one of the things that became quite apparent was the Forest Service has a lot of GIS data, and they have a lot on, you know, vegetation. They've got wildlife habitat maps. They've got riparian zones, soils, topography, you name it. And what they have typically don't have, or if they do have it, it's not very complete, is sociocultural layers. And so our thought was, is there a way that you could create sociocultural, you know, you could create layers of sociocultural data that could be integrated with these other GIS data layers. And that way the human dimensions of forest management could actually become part of their planning process. So that's kind of how we got started. And so
I could jump in here, Rebecca, and then pass it back to you for the Olympics.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So here's over the last 10 years what we have been working on, and it's predominantly with the Forest Service or with the Forest Service Research Station, Pacific Northwest Research Station, and our colleague Lee Cerveny there, who's been involved with most of these projects. We started with work on the Olympic Peninsula, had several different projects there, and Rebecca will next talk about one of those. We moved on to Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, the travel management project in that forest. And just a little side note, that was a remarkable group of different interest groups came together. I think over 40 different interest groups came together and essentially forced the Forest Service to have this participatory process so people could comment on whether roads should be closed or not. And the groups involved in this who collaborated were across the political spectrum. It was quite the interesting project. Remains to be seen what will come out of it. We did work locally in Portland, but then also a major project with the Deschutes Ochco National Forest, where we collecting data using an interactive map that was supposed to be used for, or may very well be used someday for forest planning. They haven't gotten there yet. We've evaluated how well that web map worked, and then our latest thing has been working, trying to figure out how Latinx forest users interact with the Mount Hood and Gifford Pinchot National Forests. And Rebecca will start with talking about the Olympic Peninsula project, two examples here, and then I'll talk about this Latinx forest users project. So,
great.
And then we'll summarize that at the some take-home lessons from this.
So I'm going to start with the Olympic section, and we call this "Our Olympics Are Wild Enough," and it's also an example of the politics of values mapping. The reason we call it "Our Olympics Are Wild Enough" is that while we were doing the mapping, it just happened that it coincided with this effort to expand the wilderness areas on the Olympic Peninsula. And there was a kind of a counter movement to that. And their slogan was, "Our Olympics are wild enough." So with that, I'm going to start just by giving just a very brief overview of, the key features of the Olympic Peninsula, for those who aren't familiar with it. It's in northwest corner of Washington State, and it's an area that is predominantly in federal ownership, federal and state, actually. The middle, the light green, is Olympic National Park. The darkish green around it is National Forest Lands, and then the sort of rose-colored places are state trust lands, and then the yellow places are Indian reservations. So it's an area with relatively little private land. It's also an area that gets a lot of rain, at least on the west side of the Olympic Mountains, which are smack there in the middle. And on that side, there's roughly 200 inches of rain a year. On the other side, it's substantially less, ranging from 10 to 36 inches a year on the east side. Elevation ranges from zero, sea level, to roughly 8,000 feet. So it's quite a dramatic lift. And then the population, because it's so steep and the interior, the population is just around the edges, mostly on the east side, but there's a couple towns, Forks and Quinault, that are on the west side, as well as Aberdeen and Hoquiam, which are down toward the southeast side. Okay, so what did we do? Our mapping approach was we decided we would do community workshops. And so that meant that for the most part, we were limited to residents. So this reflects resident values. And we did workshops in 8 communities. Most of them, of course, are on the east side because that's where most of the communities are. And what we had people do is we had these big tables and we had these very large maps that we placed on the tables, and people would mark with color-coded markers the places that were important to them. So we started out by asking people what places are important to you and to map those. And then we asked people to attach values. What are the values that you would give to those places? And we gave them a list of values to choose from. And then we also asked them to do activities. What do you do in these particular locations? And what I'm going to talk about next, it draws from the values section, not from the activities data that we collected. So if you look, so as it happened, for logistical reasons, we ended up having to do the workshops during 2 years. And so we started in 2010 on the east side with the east side communities. And then in 2011, we finished up with the west side communities. So just by happenstance, we ended up having these quite different set of data that turned up by year. And as you can see, there was 442 features that were mapped in 2010, 376 that were mapped in 2011. And the next thing that we did is noting that there was quite this difference in what those places, the places that were mapped. The next thing we did was we used something called Hotspot Analysis, which helps get rid of some of the noise and focuses in on those places that were the most densely mapped. And what this really illustrates is the pattern is really completely different. Now, one thing is, of course, as you might expect, the 2010 workshop folks who are on the east side, they tended to map places on the east side. That didn't surprise us because people tend to map places close to home. Likewise, with the 2011, they tended to map places that were on the west side. But as you can see, the pattern of the mapping is really different between these two maps. On the one hand, in 2010, people had it was much more spatially dispersed, whereas in 2011, it's quite clustered in 3 big clusters. And then second, the areas that were mapped, the size of the polygons that were mapped in 2010 were much smaller than those that were mapped in 2011. So then we ended up, so that was looking at the 2 separately. And so then we combined the 2. And so what did that show us? Well, it gave us a pattern, as you can see from the composite map over on the upper right here, that the pattern in the composite is much, much, much more like the 2011 than it is like the 2010 map. So that got us to wondering, well, what's explaining some of this? And the first thing that we did is we extracted the quinault participant features from this composite map. And it showed that this area up toward the top, basically it reflects the folks that were there from Forks, which is the further north town on the west side. And then if you extract the Forks people, you can see that the map essentially reflects the people who participated in the quinault workshop. So the question that we started to ask ourselves was, well, what explains this? And as it happened, during the time period when we were doing these workshops, there were 2 very long-standing debates over public land management that kind of had emerged to the surface and were quite controversial at the time. And the first one was the question of whether or not the national forest should have motorized vehicle use. And on the Olympics in particular, there was only a very small place on the forest where people were allowed to use off-highway vehicles, which is not to say that people didn't use them elsewhere, they did, but in terms of where they were supposed to use them, it was a very small area. And then and people were quite upset about that. And then the second longstanding debate, and even longer one, was whether or not the Olympic Peninsula should be a place for people to, enjoy, to protect, this rainforest, or whether it should be a working forest. And that particular debate's been going on since the late 1800s. So with the first debate, the one having to do with the off-road vehicles issue, so this really was an issue in the Forks area, because that's the area where they were the Forest Service was proposing to put in a off-road vehicle kind of, I guess, space area. And they were, during 2011, when we did the workshop in Forks, it was at that time that they were sending out, people scoping proposal to get people's input on whether or not, this was a good place to put it, what it should look like, etc. And as it happened, from our 2010 workshops, we had realized that there were very few motorized vehicle user folks that were in the rooms. And so we made a special effort actually to try to get motorized vehicle users there. We weren't aware actually of this particular trails thing being proposed, but we did know that there hadn't been very many motorized vehicle users that had participated in our other workshops. So we went and we approached the Blue Ribbon Coalition, which is a group that that tries to maintain public access to motorized access specifically to Forest Service lands. And as it happened, total coincidence, they were hosting a public meeting for the off-road vehicle riding in the Kalewa watershed, which is in the Forks area. And it was actually the week after our workshop was hosted. So what ended up happening was we got a lot of people there that were interested in motorized vehicle use. And we were able to break down the data to see, it just happened that we had done a workshop in Port Angeles in 2010. And so at that Port Angeles workshop, there were no motorized vehicle folks there. At the 2011 one, there were people at Forks that were actually from Port Angeles. So we took the data from the Port Angeles people from 2010 and compared those with the people from Port Angeles in 2011, and it was very clear, you can see from the map, that the places that were mapped were quite different. And the main area that was mapped, this A, that's the big red area that's marked with an A in 2011. So that happens to be exactly, or at least it coincides on one side, with the area that has been proposed to be an off-road vehicle place. And what we think was going on is the off-road vehicle people came to the workshop. We know for a fact that some of the people got confused and thought it was actually the scoping workshop for the Forest Service. And so they came to map the places where they wanted there to be off-road vehicle use. And as you can see from the red area, it's actually quite large, quite a bit larger than what the Forest Service was proposing. So that was the Forks situation. The second situation, issue number 2, had to do with the Wild Olympics Wilderness and Wild Scenic Rivers Act debate that was going on. And what had happened is in 2000, I think it was 2008, the idea of having more wilderness and more wild and scenic rivers had been brought forward by a number of groups interested in the Olympic Peninsula. And in 2011, the bill was brought before Congress to consider making these wildernesses and these wild and scenic rivers. And as part of that, they created a map. And this is the map that's shown here, is the map that they created. The yellow, so the big brown area is the Olympic Park. And then the yellow places are the proposed wilderness areas. And then there's virtually all of the rivers that are there were proposed as wild and scenic rivers. So you can see it's, it's fairly substantial additions, and it was quite controversial. If you look at the left or the right-hand side, there was as we were going about the peninsula, we saw all these signs. You'd see them everywhere, no new wilderness, no national park expansion, or, our future support Wild Olympics. It was quite tense at the time. So meanwhile, now we're holding our workshop in Quinault, which is kind of the heart of the opposition to the Wild Olympics. And it was quite tense. And as you'll see from the maps that I'm going to show, it affected what ended up happening in the workshop. So what ended up happening is something that we're calling organized strategic mapping. And we think what was going on is the people who came to that workshop, there was roughly, roughly almost 40 people, which is quite a lot compared to most of the other workshops. And what ended up happening is they ended up marking all these locations that are quite close to Quinault and that more or less correspond with some of these areas that are proposed for wilderness. The area that's at the top, the top circle, red circle there, that's state trust land. So what we think was going on is they were using this workshop as a way to get their values about what they wanted to see happen kind of out into the wider world. So you can see so what makes us think that this is organized strategic mapping as opposed to some other type of mapping? So if you look at the maps, so we had people mark these on Mylar. So Mylar is like this clear plastic. And so then we could then transfer it to a GIS thing. But because we had it on the Mylar, you could see how people were overlaying things. And so what you see on the left-hand side here is from the Quinault workshop, and it's an example of just one table. And you can see mostly it was polygons that they marked, and they were extremely large polygons. This is essentially the entire peninsula that's taken up by their polygons. And the other thing is where you see those ones where there's like 4 or 5 lines that are all real close together, that's because those are places that people wanted to indicate were the exact same place. So you had a number of people at this table that were all marking the exact same place. Now, if you go to Port Townsend, you can see it's a mix of lines and polygons. They're scattered all over, and where there are polygons, they're quite small. So there's actually very little overlap in the Port Townsend one. And so we know for a fact, since we happen to be there, that what happened is that people, there was a man that was kind of the leader of the anti-wild Olympics that was at the workshop, and he was at one of the tables, and we saw people go over to that table, look at what he was mapping, and go back to their tables and map the same thing. So we know that there was, in fact, a concerted effort to map the same thing. The other thing that, so we did some more analysis just to kind of, it's not just a visual thing, but just to take a look at some of the statistics. And if you looked at the 100 largest polygons, you could see that there were 91% of the 100 largest polygons were mapped in 2011, even though the number of features in 2011 was less than half of the total number of features that were mapped. So clearly, there's a skew for the large polygons in the 2011 data. And then the second piece of statistical analysis that we did is we looked at the issue of clustering. And what the clustering showed us was that so the higher the z-score is, the more it's clustered. And it turns out that for all of them, with the exception of the workshops in Aberdeen, all of them showed some clustering. But that's not a surprise because, as I said, people tend to map things close to home. So you're going to see clustering. But what's different is that it's substantially different in Quinault. Quinault is twice, it has the z-score that's more than twice that of any of the others. The other thing that's interesting, so clearly they were mapping something in a very different way than the others. The other thing that's quite interesting is even though Forks showed the same kind of density for its particular space, its clustering wasn't any more than either Hoodsport or Port Angeles. And so it wasn't nearly as clustered. And to us, what we interpreted that as is people came to Forks wanting to map the places that they felt were important for them for motorized vehicle use, but they weren't talking to each other and looking at each other's maps to see what the other people were mapping. The people at Quinault had figured out that if you mapped, everybody mapped the same thing and you mapped large areas, you were going to end up with a map that showed very dense polygons in those areas that they cared about. So it's quite an interesting, lesson in how people might, take a particular exercise that we as researchers just, it never occurred to us people would do that. And yet, because of the political situation going on at the time, people took, they took advantage of our workshop to be able to get their views out into the public eye. So with that, I am going to turn it over to David, who is going to talk about a very different set of circumstances.
Right, and I'm going to probably go through this quickly so we can still leave enough time for questions. Yeah, so this is an ongoing project we have trying to, and that the Forest Service was asking us to find out what places and values does the Latinx community have associated with Mount Hood National Forest and Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. So how do we even get started with this sort of thing when you have two non-Hispanic, non-Spanish speaking people doing the research? We talked to a lot of people. We had brainstorming sessions with people from Mount Hood and Gifford-Pinchot, kind of realized that they don't know too much about this. We assessed demographics of the population of the Portland area in general. We met with a number of Latinx community groups, but most of them aren't really appropriate for this project because they're representing everyone and not people who are outdoor users. We finally did find two groups that we could work with, Vive Northwest and the next door is in Hood River. as that we could work with as partners, because they have a focus on the outdoors. And we even did a few tours of recreation sites in both forests to see who's using those sites. So we settled on trying a number of different things. We did our human ecology mapping type exercise with focus groups that I'll describe here in a second. And we created some new things besides mapping for the folks at the workshop to do, having to do with outdoor activity preferences and barriers to using the outdoors. We did one attempt at tabling for data collection and one intercept survey at Lost Lake up in Mount Hood National Forest. The tabling exercises is at the Multicultural Resource Fair in Clark County. This is something the Forest Service was really excited about. I don't think Rebecca and I were excited about this because we kind of knew it wouldn't work because lots of people were attending this. It was mostly Hispanic population that attended, but very few people were active outdoor users. And add to that you're not going to spend 10 minutes filling out a survey at such an event. So over the course of a day, I think we had less than 20 places identified on a map. But we had lots of stickers and giveaways that attracted tons of people to the table. So if you want to talk to people, this is great. If you want to collect data, not so much. So, okay, that didn't work. So next, we worked with Vive Northwest and we did 3 focus groups with them. And we did a collaborative design of the whole workshop with them. They created a recruitment video to get people to show up. We got a total of 43 people to participate. We held 2 at Portland State. We had 1 at Lacamas Lake over in Clark County. And the way this generally worked, we had an icebreaker to start, funny thing. Then we did a mapping exercise, not unlike what Rebecca described, having to do with values and activities and such. And then we did this activity sorting exercise that I'll describe in a second, asked people about barriers and strategies, and then we had an open discussion at the end. And our lessons learned is that there's no way we could have pulled this off without Vive Northwest. They were the key partner here, and we staffed each focus group with 3 to 5 Spanish speakers. And what it resulted in were very rich conversations because the setting was quite relaxed. Vive Northwest ordered dinner for these things. They were great. And one of them, the Lacamas Lake one, involved a hike afterwards. And so these were successful, and we learned a lot in the process. So the mapping part of this, not a great variety of places were marked, and this will make sense in a moment. And they're all kind of the big hitters of Mount Hood National Forest, and almost nobody marked any place in the Gifford Pinchot. A few places were marked along the gorge, and a few people marked Mount St. Helens, but almost everyone marked, almost 90% of people marked places in Mount Hood National Forest. But this relates a lot to what do you know and who's telling you about places. Here's the favorite activities that people marked, and as per usual, hiking always is number 1 on these kind of surveys. But what we started to notice was that what people talked about in using the outdoors was really different than what we usually see in these kinds of exercises. People were, I feel like, more observant, more social. The outdoor experience was more personal and a lot less activity focused than these things usually are. So we got to see this sort of other side of how people experience the outdoors. Just not at all what you get from most people who will take these kind of surveys. And so here's a series of quotes from that people supplied, and you can kind of see that there's this engagement with the forest that is not necessarily activity-based. There's a lot of sensations. There's a lot of focus on the beauty or the natural features of places. The social part of it, people are marking, things that aren't really the outdoors necessarily, just facilities and such. And so we're getting, we're learning a lot. And, this is a group of people who interact with the outdoors in a very different way. And so we also had this activity where we created these activity boards, and everyone got a deck of cards with 35 different activities in both English and Spanish, were photos of the activity. And then there were a series of barriers, and then people were asked to put their activities into 5 different categories: what you currently do, what you used to do and don't do now, things I have no idea what this is, things I want to try, that looks cool, and things I'm not at all interested in doing. And then they're supposed to pick their top 4 barriers to using the outdoors. And so activities that came out of this, the most popular things, you can see the things like viewing and relaxing and visiting and parties, celebrations, picnicking. This is not typically an activities focused group. Things they're not interested in, I think this is noteworthy. Some of these so-called traditional forest activities of hunting and fishing were, hunting, what? I don't want to do that. Fishing, not really. Even on a lot of these gathering activities as well, people didn't want to do. And things you wanted to try, and this speaks to people really not knowing how to engage with the outdoors, but they saw a picture of these things and talked amongst themselves about it. It's like, God, I'd like to try all these things. But notice that a lot of these are very gear heavy activities, things that you don't just wander up to the forest and do these. You need the equipment for doing almost all of these. And that's an important thing to know. All right. And then barriers. Barriers were a little, I think we had an idea of what these would be, and this is not necessarily what that was, but it's mostly not knowing where to go, not having the gear to do it, and needing information about where to go. We thought things like lack of transportation, lack of money would be big ones. Having people to go with was another. And so really a lack of information out there to find out about what you can do, where you can go. Just a few little quotes here that we thought were interesting from our discussions. And so this one was, a number of people commented that the outdoors was not part of their culture, and that slowly over time, they have developed this, appreciation for the outdoors that is different than it was in the past. And this is one example. Forest was a place to work, and now it's slowly over time changed to a place to relax. Something we maybe, a number of other users don't think of that. Safety, especially from women, commenting about whether it's safe for themselves, for their kids. Even this funny little comment about, is an deer going to eat me? This speaks to not knowing about the place, really. And so there was a lot of desire for information, signs, brochures, online stuff about this to make you feel safer in the outdoors. Some sad stories about inclusion or lack thereof, of feeling out of place in certain locations and other people making them feel out of place. You realize what a big deterrent this can really be. We hope to continue this, but I think there's things that can be done in the meantime. And this is something we did talk with Vive Northwest about, is having more programs for Spanish language TV, for YouTube, the internet, that show people where to go, how to get there, and showing people actually there in the outdoors. And then something about gear and clothing and stuff to feel more comfortable going outdoors. And then some of these facilitated experience, like we had this guided hike after one of the workshops that people just loved. And that would give people the ability to meet folks to go with. and then also to have more social media information. So it's really getting information out there. This is a work in progress. We hope to continue on. I think there's one more slide. We hope to work with this other group, the next door, who is in Hood River. We expect it to get a different demographic to participate. Still, you know, the Latinx community, but a different set of people who might be working in agriculture, actually. And we'd like to do more intercept surveys. We felt those were pretty successful, the one we did at Lost Lake, and we feel like we could do more of those, because then you're capturing data from people who are actually in the outdoors, not just people who want to go to the outdoors. So
okay, so lesson number
we'll
one.
alternate here.
Yeah, lesson number one we got out of our first effort at values mapping was that this type of mapping is a form of politics. It's a form of power, and you have to think about whose values are on the map and whose values aren't on the map. It's like Sachi said, it's not, a map isn't straightforward. You know, who put this information there? And also you need to understand what's going on in terms of current resource politics if you want to be able to interpret these maps. And we found that it was important to break down the data in various ways to be able to understand what was contributing to the overall pattern. And then it's also important to remember that that pattern we ended up with on the Olympics, it's not wrong. It's not bad data. It's just a matter of it's showing one set of values more prominently than another, and there's reasons for that. And we were able, we think, to figure out what those reasons were.
Yeah, so how you collect the data really matters, and it affects who participates. So we have we described two workshop things. We've done a web-based survey, the intercept surveys. All these are different ways to capture data, and using paper maps or using computerized maps, be they online or say on tablets. The tendency is to think, well, if you just put it on the web, we're going to get a lot more participation, and you will. But who will you get participation from? Who's going to be excluded from using that sort of map? And speaking to this, you know, the Hispanic community, for our Deschutes Ocho project, we built a Spanish language survey to go along with the English survey, but that is not, it was not used, essentially. That's not how, if you want to engage that community, you're going to need to do it in a more personal way, in a workshop, and probably with paper maps than not an electronic tool.
All right. Yeah. And so kind of moving, you know, continuing on that thread of who participates, it affects what's mapped. And this is just another example from the Olympic Peninsula. It doesn't have to be the case that people are deliberately trying to show a certain point of view. In this, we took a look at the difference between what women mapped and what men mapped, and they were quite different. So it does, and if women had not been there, then you would have a different composite map than if they were there. So you need to, you know, think about who is actually there and how is that affecting what is mapped.
And then what people map actually mark on the map may not actually be the area that they value. And this is an example of, if anyone's been up to Hurricane Ridge in the Olympic National Park, beautiful viewpoint. It's just a building there. The main reason people go there is taking the view of the Olympics. The blue on the map is what you see from Hurricane Ridge. And the red is all the places, it was a popular place people marked, this is important, but they generally didn't mark the view. They just marked the place. And so when analyzing this data, you have to be cognizant of that hotspot may not actually represent the valuable location.
And last but not least, one of the questions that we ended up asking ourselves was, if we build it, will they use it, basically? Because we were collecting this data with the idea that it would then be useful for forest planners to use in the analyses that they do. But what we found is that the organizational culture of the Forest Service is actually a huge obstacle to the use of this data. First off, because there are very few social scientists, and therefore people who are there don't understand how to use the data. And then also they don't trust the data because it's not collected through a random sampling, random sampling approach, and they're afraid that if they were to use this data, because it wasn't collected using random sampling, then therefore with NEPA, they would end up being sued. And so they're just very reluctant to use it. So one of the things that we're working on right now is we have actually gotten some interest actually from actual planners to use this approach with they're redoing forest plans for Northern California and Southern Oregon. So over the next few years, they're going to be redoing those. And so we're collaborating with Outdoor Alliance to see if we can't figure out a way to do this values mapping so that these types of values can actually go into the analyses that they do for the new forest plans. So with that, I believe we had a lot of people who worked with us on this, some couple dozen people over the years. And if you want to know more, we have a site online that you could take a look at. That's it.
Thank you all very much. We have about 4 minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask something, you can put it in the chat, or you can go ahead and type stack and unmute yourself to ask a question.
I will add, if you get to that site, you'll see incredible amount of detail about each one of these kind of projects. Most of those papers and or reports have dozens and dozens of maps.
One question that came to mind for me while I was listening to the two of you talk is how much, especially with your work in the Latinx community, how involved was the actual community in helping you design your surveys? I'm thinking, I know I've made the mistake as someone who works in planning and does community outreach of maybe not co-designing surveys or workshops with the folks that that they're intended for, and then maybe like not having as good of results because I'm designing something from my own perspective. So I'm curious if you worked with, was it?
Well, we worked with V-Day Northwest as our partner for those. So, I mean, we sort of vetted everything we were doing through them. And that's what we hope, if we can do it again, we will do the same with the Next Door, another group organization that works with folks. So they were the partner, as it were, in designing this.
So this wasn't a project we talked about today, but one of the follow-on projects we did from the Olympic one was there were virtually no Latinx folks who showed up at our workshops. And we knew that at least in Forks, there's 20% of the population happens to be Latinx. So we organized a set of workshops with forest product harvesters who are almost exclusively Latinx now out of Shelton. And it was completely co-designed. That particular workshop, and it did definitely change what we did, and it was people were very pleased with it, and we actually ended up getting some changes made with Washington State Department of Natural Resources to make the woods more safe for these harvesters. So it was quite an interesting experience. Yeah.
Thanks. We have 1 more minute if anybody has any last questions.
I've been kind of wondering in the back of my mind as I've listened to you, and whether it's the type of mapping that you've been describing or any other types of maps, but especially if it's being used for the potential of policy change and that type of thing. Are there processes for validating the maps that have been created are representative? And I'm struggling with this question because of the comment about how the data's not wrong, it's the interpretation of it. So is there a process by which someone says, or can evaluate if something is missing, whether that's by intention or unintention, or some other ways in which validation is done?
We regularly know, just, and this is where the point of, knowing something about the situation, what's being planned, what's the nature of this forest, who are the users. We always point out who we're pretty confident whose opinions were not incorporated. It's usually not too hard to do that if you do have some knowledge of the forest. But getting that input from those groups is easier said than done. So, hence all the work we went through to get input from the Latinx community. That just doesn't happen. I mean, you have to actively seek it, and same would be true for a number of other groups as well. One thing I'll note is people who are older have a tendency to do these surveys. People who are younger have a tendency not to take them.
Yeah. Almost all the ones we've had have skewed high, age-wise.
It's not, in some ways not unlike voting in a manner of speaking. So, and that is consistent. So yes, and we always point those things out when we do a study.
Okay, one last thank you. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to everyone for being here.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and end our recording.